being here after 2 long days. I'm sure they have been very, very enriching for all of us. Today, as the conference approaches to an end, we have a very distinguished panel that will discuss with us for the next 70 minutes issues around representation and participation of marginalized groups in the Lebanese political sphere. So we have 5 speakers, and overall the panel will analyze the role of marginalized groups in the political sphere, examining the challenges and within the Lebanese power-sharing system. There will be different studies that will address representation as well as socio-political attitudes in the nation through public opinion polls, ethnographic studies, etc. So I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting panel. So I'm going to very quickly present our panelists. We start with Professor Carmen Jaha and Christelle Tabit. They will present a paper about the challenges that women face when trying to seek political representation. So very quickly, Carmen is an assistant professor in public administration at AUB. She's also an advisor and consultant on electoral reform and women's representations in Lebanon and other Arab countries. I'm trying to be very brief here. There's a lot to introduce, but for the sake of time, just very quickly. Christelle is also an activist and a part-time RA at AUB. She's a founding member of DAMME, and also she's a consultant in the A project. Our second speaker is Professor Reem Saab. She's also here at AUB in social psychology, and she looks at gender differences in social political attitudes in Lebanon and the Arab world, especially social political participation and their determinants. This is one area of her research. Her research is broader, but this is what matters for this panel, and she will be speaking about gender differences in political participation in Lebanon. Our third panelist is Nada. Nada Anid is the co-founder of Women in Front. She's also a member of Women in Parliament Committee, also a trainer around electoral process and gender equality, and to my surprise, a writer, a novelist, and also writes books for children. She's going to talk to us about engaging women in political and public life. Our fourth speaker is not with us physically. She's in the US currently. She has prepared her slides and has voice over them and will be joining us via Skype for the discussion. She'll be talking about sectarian and national crisis, facilitators or barriers for women and sexual minorities. She's an associate professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and she has also received many awards for her research, feminist research. And last and not least, we have George Azdir, who will be talking to us about the political participation of sexual minorities. George doesn't need introduction. He is the executive director of AFE, the Arab Foundation for Freedom and Equality. He's also a co-founder of Halam and an activist in sexuality and HIV. So I'm going to...
Thank you so much, Dr. Afyouni. I just want to say that this study is a three-way effort. So Christelle and I and Sally Ali Khalil, who's been advisor on the project, I want to thank the KIP team once again for the support and also for the grant for doing this. Our study is on how sectarian power sharing is a system of accommodation and not of inclusion. We come to this, at least myself, I'm not an expert on gender. I'm coming at the topic from a political studies perspective, right? So power sharing, demokratiya tawaffu'iyya, is being prescribed to many, many countries in the world, including places now like Syria, Iraq, Libya. So every time there's divisions or conflict, power sharing as a sort of governance is prescribed. And we argue that it only accommodates ethno-nationalist identity. It is not inclusive, particularly of gender. So this panel is on marginalized groups within the Lebanese political system, and women are the largest sizable group that is marginalized from the system, and we want to understand why. We'll try to be very brief. I'll give an introduction on the framework, and then Christelle will present the finding. There's very little research on how power sharing could challenge women's representation. There's some work done on Northern Ireland, Burundi, Rwanda, among other places, but one of the key theoretical frameworks is that if women are not on the table, particularly pre-conflict, post-conflict, when constitutions are designed, then women would tend to be marginalized from that sphere. And so our question is, where are the Lebanese women? Why aren't they in politics? The objectives of our research is to examine the lock-in effects. How does power sharing continue to favor men in politics? We want to unpack the political reasons behind this utter lack of political representation, and we mean by this in national institutions, so we mean parliament and cabinet. Two main questions: what explains this underrepresentation, and how does sectarian power sharing particularly challenge the representation of women? We've also devised probably like an interesting methodology. We wanted to bring in a women's narrative, we wanted to bring in women's voices. We used intersectionality as a paradigm, but our study is empirically grounded, and we've done biographical interviews with almost 120 women, plus a lot of practitioner reflective type data. We're coming at it. Our normative angle is that women should be better represented, and this comprises a lot of our work. So we've been for about 10 months collecting data, interviews with women, a lot of focus groups, asking women how and why they entered politics, what did she face, what was her story, what pushed her, how come this happened. That was the extent of the types of questions, and probably we can comment about that later to bring in a women's narrative to that. Will not take long on the theoretical framework. Intersectionality entails aspects that inhibits women's representation that reinforce one another, and I'll not spend a lot of time on that. We use, yes, 3 streams of literature. We critique power sharing, intersectionality, and an institutional ideational approach. Let us share the findings, which is probably more interesting.
Thank you. So I'll try to be quick as well. So I won't read all of them, I'll just share with you some interesting findings. So basically our main findings were divided into 4 categories. So the 4 titles of findings were how patriarchy in sectarianism is an obstacle for women representation. So how the sectarianism, the power sharing system based on the sect in Lebanon is in itself patriarchal. The second type of finding was the ineffectiveness of national institutions. So where the socio-psychological or how women are brought up to be more on the executive side, on the administrative side, and how our national institutions tend to be or lack the effectiveness of actually conducting work or doing politics. We also have another category of how the political career for women is not feasible, and we'll discuss this, the indicators of how it's not feasible. And finally, how politics is masculine. But I'll start with how politics is masculine. So the main findings in our study were that the language, or what we see on the media, so the talk shows, the news, whenever politicians are invited to speak in panels, in talk shows, and etc., the language they use is very violent, right? So if they don't become physically violent, they use a language that is very violent. That is not appealing for women, because we know as a social construct, women are brought up to be, wait for your turn, speak slow, use a lower tone, put your legs on top of each other, be calm. And what we see on TV or what we need in the news is a very violent type of politics. So this is one way of how politics is masculine. Another way is that it requires, in Lebanon, it evolves around clientelism, which is something that women are never taught, which is not something good, obviously, but women tend to be more honest, more oriented towards the community, the good for the benefit of the community rather than the one. However, and this is based on literature, men tend to have more ego, or more, they seek power in a different way. So they do a lot of politics behind closed doors or under the table, which is not clear. But women rather a more direct approach. The second type of finding is the ineffectiveness of national politics. And this actually is very relevant and related to the patriarchy of sectarianism. So we know that in Lebanon the power sharing system is based on sects. So sects are represented in legislative and executive branches in the country. But we know that within the sects, it's impossible or very, very hard for women to become to take very positions that are very high up, that can give them the authority to make decisions. So we don't see women priests, we don't see women mutran or patriarchs, we don't see women sheikh. So if within the sect women don't have a place to make legislation or to come up with rules and laws, then they will never be represented in the publishing system that is based on sect, that needs the approval of the sect or the sheikh or the priest to be on the list of the candidates. The third type of findings is the non-feasibility. So this is very interesting because women are expected to get married, have children, and have a lot of responsibilities, social responsibilities, take care of the elderly, be at home, cook for the husband, and etc. And although we're trying to break that stereotype, but still women don't have time to attend meetings at 10 p.m. They can't be on Sunday after church doing a lunch with all the men in the municipality to decide on things. They have to be at home cooking. And that's where all the decisions are made in informal meetings where they meet for drinks at night or to play tawle or etc. So it's not feasible. 1, 2, they don't have the money to enter politics. So it takes a lot of money for women to enter the political sphere. I'm sorry, am I? Okay. And that's due to the fact that at a very young age, she needs to finish school or university to start working, because women are not expected to work at a younger age, below 18, and then she's supposed to focus on things that are not very income generating. And when she does start to get paid, it's always less than men. So by the time she decides to actually go into politics, she doesn't have enough money as much as men. And the last finding, the patriarchy of sectarianism, which I brought up earlier, and it's the fact that women within sects cannot become, cannot get positions that are in a decision-making position, in a level, so they can't be represented in politics. And thank you very much. Thank you.
Sorry, I have to play the mean role person.
It's so hard.
Yeah.
Okay, so hello everyone. I'm very happy to share with you today some findings on a research project on gender differences in political participation in Lebanon. So the latest Global Gender Gap report shows that the Middle East and North Africa rank last globally in the Gender Gap Index. And of the 5 countries with the lowest scores on political empowerment measured in the form of political representation, 4 are from the Arab world, and Lebanon is one of them. Now, an important determinant of political representation is political participation. So the more women politically participate, the more chances they have of being politically represented. And what we understand by political participation is any activity intended to influence the work of the government by influencing policymakers, implementation of policies, or the selection of policymakers. So it's activities such as voting, collective action, so social protest, membership in associations, and membership in political parties. So our question is, are there actually gender differences in Lebanon on different forms of political participation, and how can we begin to explain these differences? The analysis is based on public opinion data, and it's part of a larger project where we're looking at gender differences in political participation in the Arab world, but this is work in progress, so I'll just be presenting the data on Lebanon. Now, the evidence of a gender gap in political participation has been well documented worldwide, particularly in Western countries, where women are significantly less likely to participate in political life, despite significant improvement lately. Now, comparatively less research has been done on this topic in the Arab world, but the available data also shows that women are less likely to take part in political life. It's been argued that women participate less than men in political life, either because they cannot, as in they lack the resources, or because they will not, as in they are not interested, among other reasons. So we'll focus on testing these 2 reasons. Now, some scholars have indeed found that the gender gap in political participation can be explained by women's lower interest in politics. So it's not that they're interested but they're not participating, they're actually less interested altogether. Also, another explanation has been lower levels of education among women and lower levels of employment. The available research on the Arab world is limited in various ways. It tends to focus only on few forms of political participation, or it tends to examine political participation as one construct rather than looking at the different forms, and it tends to treat the Arab world as one entity rather than looking at individual countries. So our research looks at whether there are gender differences in political participation in Lebanon on different forms of political participation, namely voting, attending meetings, association membership, political party membership, and collective action. And we try to see whether we can explain any of the observed gender differences through differences in political interest, education, employment, and income. Our method relies on a secondary data analysis of public opinion data, namely the Arab Barometer, which is collected every couple of years. So the data is from Lebanon, collected in July 2013. The sample size is 1,200 citizens, and it's a nationally representative sample. The variables were measured in different ways. There was a measurement of whether people voted in the last parliamentary elections, whether they attended meetings in the during the latest electoral campaigns, whether they were members of political parties, whether they had participated in collective action in the last 3 years, whether they belonged to associations such as professional associations, trade unions, and the like. Political interest was measured by asking respondents how interested they are in politics and to what extent they follow political news. And our measure of income is actually a subjective income, so how do you stand compared to the rest of the citizens? And we had also measures of education and employment. So the first step is, are there actually gender differences on different forms of political participation? What does the data tell us? We find indeed that men are 1.27 times more likely to vote than women. So it's a small difference, but it's there. Men are 1.7 times more likely to attend voting meetings than women. Men are 3 times more likely to be members of political parties than women. Men are 1.38 times more likely to participate in collective action than women. Now, interestingly, there are no differences in associational membership. So we won't be talking about this for the rest of the presentation. So we'll just focus on the other types of participation. So the next question was, could these gender differences in political participation be due to differences in political interests? Are women actually less interested in politics? And this is what we find. So women tend to be less interested in politics, and this lower interest in politics translates into lower political participation. And that's the case for voting, attending meetings, political party membership, and collective action. So our next question was then to try and explain political interest itself. Could gender differences in political interest be explained by differences in education, employment, and income? And what we found is that of education, income, and employment, employment is the only one that actually explains gender differences in political interest. So women tend to take less part in the labor force, and this lower presence in the labor force results in lower political interest, which in turn translates into a lower likelihood of voting, attending meetings, being members of a political party, and taking part in collective action. So, to conclude, women tend to show lower political participation than men in Lebanon, though these differences tend to be small or small to medium-sized, with the largest difference observed in membership of political parties. One potential explanation of the gender gap is that women tend to participate less than men in the labor force, and this seems to make them less interested in politics, which in turn makes them participate less in the political domain. Now these are, I'd like to stress that these are preliminary findings. This is work that is still in progress. So we are also in the process of testing alternative models, alternative explanations and variables. But it seems like participation in the labor force is an important pathway for engaging women in politics. One thing to keep in mind is that it may be no surprise that Lebanon ranks very low in the Global Gender Gap Report on both labor force participation as well as political empowerment. So the data seems to be related to this notion as well. Thank you very much. I'd love to hear your feedback and questions.
طب
Hello, everyone. So after the valuable things you've heard, I'd like to explain why we are focusing as an NGO and with other NGO on quota as a temporary solution to increase women's participation in political participation in Lebanon. So while we're working on different levels, strengthening the capacity of women, Lebanese women in all regions, increasing the visibility of expert women by highlighting their achievements, partnering with the media to create public awareness on gender equality, we are constantly promoting and advocating for reforming the Lebanese electoral law to include a quota for women. It's certainly the most proven, efficient temporary solution to which countries and communities resort to enhance the participation of underrepresented factions. So the quota system was introduced in around 128 countries through an amendment of the constitution or through the electoral law. Quota is not an aim by itself, but it's a mean. In fact, it's the only way, and we'll see why, that will get us there. Here you can see the top-ranking countries 20 years after the quota. Global average for women in parliament has doubled from 11% in 1995 to 22% in 2015. So why our efforts are concentrating on lobbying for the quota? Because there is no national strategy to fight stereotypes, extremism, and discrimination towards women. Since 2013, we have been meeting with heads of political parties, MPs, and members of the electoral committee explaining how quota works. We've been lobbying with different coalitions for the same purpose, unifying our demand, 30% quota. Why we focused on stakeholders and MPs more than public opinion? Because they are the decision makers in this matter and because they control names in the first place. And because they still believe that women are the weakest link on an electoral list. Because international conventions and treaties have produced nothing but promises. So Lebanon was signed in 1995, the CEDAW treaty with no reservation on the quota and didn't apply it. And none of the draft laws that include electoral draft laws that included women's quota have ever seen the light to date. Because figures speak for themselves, so Lebanon is ranked 180 on over 187 country regarding the representation in parliament. Because since 1953, nothing has changed. So Lebanese women got the right to vote and present their candidacy in 1953. And while other countries in the Arab world got them far after. Even Switzerland, women got the right to vote in 1970, and we're still at 3.1 representation. Because the best we could do was in 2005, where we had female women parliamentarians because the number of female candidacy is very low. Our political system is repellent to women candidates and to newcomers. Because political parties don't include naturally women on their list, and this have been proven during the last municipal elections, political alliances led women candidates to be removed from electoral lists, sometimes without notifying them. Because talks about an inclusive government don't even include women. And you see that we have only one woman in this government. The only public field where women are present is in the public service, where senior civil servants prove their capabilities by passing and succeeding exams. because despite a growing presence of women in all economic sectors, when it comes to political empowerment, Lebanon is ranked 143 out of 144 countries. Because we don't have female role models in the public field, so how can voters trust the ability of women in dealing with national issues if they don't see and hear them talking about their related problems? Because the saying, if only women voted for women, the problem would be solved, and we heard that often, is an aberration. Women don't form a single political party. Like all citizens, they are part of the social, political, and cultural fabric of this country. The good news is that public opinion is ready to vote for women. And this is a survey done by NDI right after the municipal elections. And voters said that when they didn't choose a woman, it was either because there was no woman on their list or because no woman matched their political views. There is a slight improvement within political party structure. And all these reasons makes the quota an inevitable step. So that's why we studied the electoral law. We studied a way to introduce quotas in any new form of electoral law. And simulations helped us to be more convincing while lobbying. So under majoritarian law, we can say that quota works only if you reserve seats. And this is, while lobbying, it's a problem because politicians hate that. Even if they have reserved seat by confessions, they don't like the idea of giving reserved seats to women by gender. On the proportional law, and this is a solution that has been presented to us, we have to be sure that women, I will not go into details, but women should have a good rank on the electoral list. In the mixed law, you have 30% on candidacy, 30% on reserved seats. The problem with simulations that it shows clearly that a male MP should be pushed aside in order to give his seat to some unknown woman. Stating publicly that one is in favor of temporary measures became quite trendy these days. So that's why we created a social media called Tabiqu Aqwalakum. So we took everyone, apply your statement. It's called accountability. So despite all what is being said, we came to the conclusion that political coalitions are divided into three groups. Supportive, 3 political parties, mildly in favor, 2 political parties, not in favor, 3 political parties. However, because the country is always managing some major crisis, nobody is ready to fight for quotas. As soon as any electoral law will be adopted, technical solutions to include a gender quota could be easily implemented. All what it needs is a real political will. Thank you.
So I'll be mostly sharing stories to speak about the barriers against political participation for sexual minorities, mostly LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. What does it mean being politically involved? It means being able to make decisions on the local level, be part of a union, be part of a political party, and to feel safe that you can organize and make public statement as an individual. So how can you be politically involved and yet not hide your sexuality? The political participation of LGBT people goes back to, at least visibly, to 2002 in the protest against the war on Iraq. And back then there were a group of gay men and women who held sign Gays Against War. The reaction to the media the next day was on the cover of one of the magazines, the people of Lot are still alive between us. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah are still alive. So they dismissed completely their political opinion and they focused only on their sexuality, being kicked out completely of the movement. moving forward to 2005, when the Cedars Revolution against the Syrians started in Lebanon, people who went in first were people who were against the system. Everybody who felt that they're oppressed went there the first day to protest. Eventually, including the LGBT community, eventually political parties took over this revolution and they started putting camps. The people there, the LGBT people who were there in the protest, they were physically kicked out of the camps, they dragged out. And when we tried to confront the political parties, they refused to speak to us. This is again a way where the LGBT community tried to be part of the political life. Forward to the municipality elections, Beirut Madinati. I'm sure you've heard of Beirut Madinati. They tried different ways to discredit Beirut Madinati. Using the first one was they're getting foreign fund, but Beirut Madinati was not getting foreign fund. They said that they've been trained by the Americans and the European. That was not true as well. So they failed to find any traditional excuse. What came on before, probably not many of you heard of that. Somebody knew that there are some gay supporters of Beirut Madinati, and they started screenshotting Facebook profiles of openly gay people supporting Beirut Madinati just to discredit Beirut Madinati, saying, so the gays are supporting this movement, do you really want to vote for that? So I myself at some point I was thinking, should I stop my public support to Beirut Madinati or not, as an LGBT activist? But they did great, but still, the sexuality was used against this political, at least the initiative. Civil society. Since we started Hilm in 2004, we had probably one organization who's willing to work with us. Most of the organizations, they preferred not to address the issue. It's getting better now, they have more and more partners, but still the LGBT rights usually is the first thing they drop when they need to make compromises. So if there's an agreement with the government that we're going to improve this kind of right, but let's drop the LGBT one, they will drop it. And this is something constantly that we face when we were part of other human rights organizations. So why not organize ourselves? This is how we started Hilm in 2004. We applied for the Ministry of Interior. We're still waiting for the reply till now. So that's 13 years later. When the last time I went to check on our file, they took out the file and there was a big sticker on it saying, من المعيب التعامل مع هكذا ملف. I'm ashamed to deal with this kind of file. So the woman working there didn't want even to check the file when it was thrown away. So yeah, Hilm was never given the right to organize. It's not a moral person. They cannot sue the government. They cannot go and present someone in court. So the right to organize doesn't exist, and Hilm is the living proof of that. The existence of Hilm itself is threatened every year. Every now and then they decide that we need to shut down the organization. Every now and then recently there's a campaign. It started with the Inside Club here at AUB, dealing with homosexuality. Then fortunately they couldn't do it here in AUB. They moved to AUL in Gola, and there someone said they were starting a political campaign to shut down the organizations and to increase the sentence for homosexuality from 1 year to more than that, because it's a serious problem that we need to deal with. Unfortunately, they can express their opinion anywhere, in public and in the media, but we don't have this option. We don't have the right to organize. They already organized, I think, since the issue with the Inside Club here. I've been receiving invitations from different recently created NGOs who want to focus on combating homosexuality. So this is what we have to deal with. Safety and trust. Do we trust the government? We don't. Do we trust the police? We don't. Even when we win, if you want to go public and protest, we have probably 3,000 people on Facebook saying they're coming. We end up 25 there. I don't blame people. People are scared to be there because we don't know at any point the police can actually arrest us. So there's lack of protection also that makes it impossible for us to have this public, at least big public movement. And when we manage to actually win the case, they really apply it. Have you heard about the ghost issue? The club, the ghost? So also a few years ago, the mayor of the Queen decided to raid the club illegally, and he went inside and arrested 4 Syrian gay and trans people, took them to the municipality, undressed them, took pictures of them naked, and sent it to the media. We filed 12 complaints against him. That was 4 years ago. He's still the mayor of the Queen now. I think still there. So yeah, I mean, these are the major barriers to the political participation of the LGBT community. Now, let's look at society in general. Is society ready for this? And when we did a study with Ipsos and interviewed 16 members of the parliament, asking them if they think we should address the homosexuality now, and they all said that our society is not ready to address this issue, and let's just turn the blind eye. I mean, we don't speak about it, we don't do anything, which is not right, because I mean, turning the blind eye means that the police can still harass and arrest people, and they can't. We have no means to defend them. So we went to the Ipsos and we did a study across Lebanon. It's not a big presentation, so I'm just going to present some of the interesting findings. When we asked them, what do you think about homosexuality? Is homosexuality an illness? Is homosexuality immoral? Should we protect our society from homosexuality? Most of the people said they agreed. They actually had very negative views on homosexuality. It went from 65% saying that we should find a way to control homosexuality, not to spread as a virus. 66% thought that gay people are a threat to society. So there's very negative views. But then we asked, what do you think we should do to LGBT people? Should we send them to prison? 70 said no. Should we send them to capital punishment? 85 said no. We still have 15% who think we should. But still, I mean, so I think that the trend that is now is that we, in society at least, and this is it's reflected in the way the government is dealing with the situation, we don't mind if they exist, if they stay silent and in the closet. Once they go out and they want to organize and they want to be public, then we will have people like Inside the Club and whoever is behind them campaigning against us and wanting to shut the organizations down and anything related to LGBT rights. So this is it. I will continue the conversation later with questions. Thank you.
So last speaker in the US, we're going to run the slides and hopefully have voice over them. The voice yeah, but it usually plays La Hala.
Sectarian and national crisis, facilitators or barriers for women and sexual minorities. The research question is, how do moments of intensified political crisis in Lebanon impact concepts and practices of heteropatriarchy, as well as the possibilities for social transformation led by women and the marginalized, including sexual minorities? This project investigates the conditions through which the period between the summer of 2015 and December 2016, a period of intense political crisis in Lebanon, has created spaces for the political participation of women and LGBT individuals, and for social movements committed to ending gender and sexuality-based oppression, and for new definitions of feminism and LGBT justice. The research took place through interviews with activists who were in their 20s and 30s. They are the focus of this research because they are on the front lines of engaging with how feminist and LGBTQ concerns in Lebanon are impacted by other broader social justice issues, such as sectarianism, militarism, and the struggle for having basic needs met. I used a methodology of feminist collaboration And I designed the project with members of various feminist collectives in Lebanon. Grassroots feminist activists assisted with the research design and the interviews, and this allowed for the research design to focus on the needs of feminist activists in Lebanon so that the research will actually contribute to their activism and their work. I conducted with some of the activists I worked with 12 interviews with 12 feminists in Lebanon who work with various organizations. And I focused on their activism before, during, and after the garbage protests of 2015. The garbage crisis of 2015 started in Naama in August 2015, followed by the formation of the You Stink movement. Protesters were concerned about the garbage crisis, government corruption, the centralization of services, and new elections. Research findings. The research found that participation in the protests supported a process by which feminist activists are innovating what I'm calling here an intersectional feminist and LGBTQ framework for addressing struggles related to gender and sexuality in Lebanon. This intersectional feminist approach became more pronounced and visible during this time of crisis. During the garbage protests and the violent state responses to them, feminist activism illuminates the multiple forms of violence that are not often publicly discussed, even among activists. So what this means that during the garbage protests, these activists that identified as feminists were asserting that in order to adequately address struggles related to gender and sexuality for the majority of people in Lebanon, this necessitates an analysis of just political representation, ending government corruption, ending racism and state violence against refugees, and committing to equity related to employment and access to basic issues such as water, electricity, and healthcare. So I'll now turn to what I'm calling components of feminist intersectionality in Lebanon. And I'm using this to say that the feminist activists I worked with were actually developing and innovating a feminist theory and a feminist practice for Lebanon that can adequately address both gender and sexuality issues in relation to the broader social justice issues in Lebanon. So here are the components. 1, state violence as a form of gender violence. So the activists were asserting that power cuts and garbage are a form of violence against women, not only in the streets, but in the home where women are not able to do their work. And the work that women do at home remains largely invisible and unpaid. Feminist activists work to uplift the voices of women who were disproportionately impacted by the electricity and garbage crises, including poor women and marginalized women, including those who could not join the protests. And here's a quotation from one of the interviewees. We talked about migrant domestic workers. Is this protest a safe space for them? We called the patriarchal regime lethal. And I'll go on now to the next slide. They called attention to the struggle for gender and bodily rights as integral to this struggle and the very process of holding the government accountable. 2, the second component of their feminist framework calls for ending sexism in the movement and refusing to be silent on sexual harassment between and among activists. They were fought against situations where women, there were only a few women in meetings, and the majority of the meetings would include men. They remembered women within leftist groups being told to shut up when they brought up incidents of sexual harassment. They critiqued the media for turning the issue of sexual harassment in the protests into erotic, sensationalized stories. So they said that we need to have a feminist bloc and a house to strategize. Three, they committed to feminist safe spaces. Out of the violence and patriarchal practices they faced, they produced new forms of organizing and mobilizing women. Safe spaces to talk about silencing by organizers, harassment, and patriarchal discourses. Four, they talked about protest as a feminist space. Their marches included dancing, and they reclaimed the streets as spaces where their bodies can be free. They refused classism as part of their feminist politics. So they fought against a dominant discourse that blamed poor men for disrupting protests or for sexual harassment. They committed to increasing women's political participation. Some feminist and queer women participated in different capacities in the municipality elections around that time. To summarize, their feminist approach entailed ending state violence and committing to an intersectional feminism that connects violence against migrant workers, the garbage crisis, the personal status law under the sectarian system, and electricity cuts, all as feminist issues and forms of violence that target women in particular ways. They committed they stressed that Palestinian refugees, domestic migrant workers, trans people, and women have long experienced violence at the hands of the state with impunity. They called attention to the struggle for gender and bodily rights, and they contributed a feminist analysis to the broader social justice struggles over big business and privatization. And to conclude, I will continue exploring these questions as the research continues. Questions about what feminist and LGBTQ activists contribute to broader social justice movements, and other such questions. Thank you very much.
Just gonna have Nadine on Skype with us so that she can contribute to the Q&A.
Hello.
Hi, Nadine.
Hi, everybody.
Hello. So welcome to the panel. We just finished the presentations of the 5 panelists, including yours, and now we're going to open the floor to questions and answers. So if we have a question that is directed to you, we'll let you know and point the camera towards you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, towards the audience. So we start with the questions. Any questions for our panelists? Yes? Can somebody have the mic here? Is there a microphone for the audience? Yeah. Over there.
Nareem, okay, I wanted to ask you, you said that a lot of women are not interested in being part of the part of politics in Lebanon as in general. Do you think, because then you said that the percentage of the voting and all that is very minimal, it's 1 point something usually, men are more likely to vote by 1 point something. So don't you think that the lower interest in joining the politics or politics in general is related to not having quota. يعني لأنه there's none available. يعني when it comes to الجمعيات الخيرية, whatever, they're doing like big speeches, they're coming up with, يعني you're all women here, and I think a lot of women مثل هلا نادين لبكة, she is interested, like the interest is there, but don't you think the interest is lower because there are non-quota, there's no quota available? Should I ask all the questions or?
One question per person to allow.
Oh. Okay, another question for Reem though. Why is the sample يعني dated in 2013? Is it because there are no resources to do it's kind of outdated for a study? Are there no resources, or because I don't think this sample really represents the situation right now, 2017.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for these questions. I'll start with the second one. Yes, the data is not recent. This is because the air barometer has various waves. They just collect data every couple of years. So what we're in the process of doing right now is testing examining the same questions in data that spans 2006 all the way to 2016. So we'll have more data available, but they don't do this poll every year. And the other available public opinion polls do not have measures of all the different kinds of political participation. So what's good about the air barometer is that it actually tests for different kinds, like collective action, like voting, like association membership, and so on. At least we're comparing with the public opinion polls that are done by Arabs in the Arab world. So that's the Arab Opinion Index and the air barometer. The first question is a very important one, and by the way, I also would like to mention that the project is done by several people. I failed to mention that, so it's done in collaboration with Charles Harib, Charlotte Karam, Noor Mhanna, and Farah Reyes. About the first question, I think it looks like we're focusing more on what is wrong with women themselves here in this project. It looks like we're focusing on this and why aren't they participating in politics. But of course, if we want a holistic view of what is happening, we have to look at how the political institutions themselves are not making it possible for women to take part in politics. So even the finding regarding employment, so what is it about the labor force, the labor market that is not making it so possible for women to enter the workforce? What is it about the political system itself that is making, that is not allowing women to get more into politics, the quota system, etc. And I think this links well with the presentation that was given about the quotas and also by Carmen and Christelle about the system itself and how it keeps women away. So yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity to clarify that.
Nadine, would you like to comment on the first question?
I mean, it seems like the question was mostly about political participation in the official sense, in terms of, because I didn't hear the paper that the question was referring to. Whereas the research that I was doing, as you know, had to do with women's interest in, mobilizations and protests. So I think that, I'm happy to take questions specifically about that.
Hi, Summa Rifai. I have a question for you, Nada. It's regarding the quota. You said that 3 parties agreed to that, 2 of them did not. Actually, they're not in the middle, and 3 of them are not in favor. My question is, can we know who are they?
Yeah, sure, if you want.
This is 1. 2, and in order to know how effective who are not in favor, how are they gonna, if they gonna vote for the quotas, if they're gonna really affect the impact of that. And do you think the 2 parties that are in the middle, do you think I believe this is the way to get for the quota, we have to work on them.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
So the two parties that are in favor are Mustaqbal and Amal. They are very loud and verbal about it. The parties that, I mean, just to say that small parties tend to be less in favor for obvious reason, because they sacrifice a seat. So that's why. Even though that KIP, which is a small, relatively small party, is in favor. And the head of the party stated very recently. The parties that are in the middle, Lebanese forces are for the quota, but they will not kill for it. I mean, if it happens, they would vote for it. It's
good, we don't want them to kill.
And the Ishtiraki, the PSP, they are recently also for. Against is the FPM, they are against Hezbollah, and Marada. Yeah, they are strongly against. So, did I answer? Yeah. So we're working, as for lobbying, we're working on the middle. I mean, it's.
Hi, thank you very much for very interesting talks, and apologies, missed the first one. But there was a comment in one of the talks that says, that someone said, all that it needs is real political will. And my sense is that most politics in the world, but especially here in Lebanon, will only follow demands by people. They will not be leading the edge in terms of creating change. And maybe in some ways this is even more appropriate because they are supposed to be representing us. And so I'm wondering from our side and people in this room and from your perspective on the panel about like the state and the level of engagement, activism, training around activism. Why are there so few political movements, even within students or others? How can we support more engagement around this, training around political campaigns, et cetera, and in a real applied sense? I think that the main reason that Beirut Medinati lost is not because of those things. I don't think actually that the other campaigns won. I think Beirut Medinati lost because of some very basic mistakes that were made in terms of political campaign strategy. And I think that they should have won. And I think that other similar movements can win, but that we somehow need to take a step back and sort of study or move forward more in terms of our sophistication of political activism in this space. So I don't know, I'm curious what efforts there might be or what efforts you folks think there could be to push that level of intensity of new political movements on these issues.
I was struck by the new political, going back to Beirut Medinati, I think we have the strongest political system in the world because it's based on fear. People are scared of change. And we have this culture that any change coming might affect me as a Christian, as a Muslim. So I need these leaders to protect me. I hate them, but I need them. So this is the culture that we need to change now. I don't think that people don't know how to campaign. Beirut Medinati, most of the people, they didn't have to say anything except that you are against the system, and people voted for them. They won 60% part of Beirut, 40% in the other. But I think what we need to challenge altogether, and this women, everybody else, that to overcome this kind of fear. The knowledge, I think we have it. It's not that we don't have the knowledge. This one, yeah.
Can I answer? Yes. Concerning, if we organize a protest now for women's participation, we'd gather maximum 50 persons. I mean, for this, the change should and will come within political parties. I mean, it's women in political parties are to 40 to 60% as members in political parties. If they don't ask for more, for a change in the conception of their participation, nothing will happen. I mean, it's like this. Plus, these are the MPs who would vote for quota. I mean, we have to convince them. I mean, if nobody would go and protest for this, I mean, for the garbage, you couldn't gather the whole country to protest for garbage. So political participation is, women's political participation is very concentrated on political parties. And there is, we have to say, a misconception for the politics, the role of politics. For us, politics is the nuclear treaty between Iran and Iraq, and it's not the everyday things that we are struggling. That's why women are not maybe interested in the sense of interested in participating and taking more leading roles in politics.
This is Nadine. I could jump in if you want.
Yes, sure. We'll have Christelle, and then Nadine, you can jump in.
I'll just take a second. So just to add on and to build on what Nada and George are saying, also in our finding, another way why it's harder for women to organize is how, so what George was saying, fear, but it's also how sectarianism is dividing women issues. So women don't see themselves as one group of oppressed based on gender. For example, if we take the example of what Hezbollah Nasrallah said the other day about the early marriages, and you'd be surprised that a lot of women who are from the Shia sect are supportive of this discourse. And this makes it even harder to work with them and to ask them to help us be more representative in politics. So this was also a main finding, and I think it's very important to remember that patriarchy and sectarianism is the main reason why the minorities in Lebanon are not getting together and lobbying together for a better income.
Yeah, Nadine. Nadine, can you jump in?
So I can, yeah, I'm speaking from the position of researching women grassroots activists. So I think it's important to what we mean by politics, and remember that there are different types of politics, and there's also grassroots politics and organizing. So I think that when we talk about grassroots activism, there are two types of activism. There's activism and organizing or mobilize. So the activism is kind of happens with the people who are already converted, you know, the people who are already going to the meetings. But it seems in terms of the women that I've been doing my with and what they think in terms of the activist groups in Lebanon is that there's not enough mobilizing and organizing. For example, the lack of labor unions, the lack of reaching out to people who are disproportionately impacted by, you know, the issues of, you know, whatever the issue is, sectarianism, poverty. And so I think that's a really crucial piece, is how to build connections between women who are already involved and women who are not involved. And that takes hard work. It's not something that happens overnight. It happens through building relationships, through working together, creating projects that are collaborative. And then I think the other piece is, two more points about it. One is that when there are social movements that are not about gender, so let's say we're talking movement that's mobilizing against the garbage crisis or mobilizing against, you know, corruption or whatever it is, or sectarianism. The other problem is that we need to make sure that those movements have a feminist analysis so that, you know, it's not only, but everybody who's working for social justice to have a sense that sectarianism itself is patriarchy and heteropatriarchy. So if you really want to end sectarianism, it will be essential to also take on the issue of patriarchy. So if we can ensure that activists who don't work on gender have a feminist analysis, that can also, you know, bring in more of women's voices and kind of insist that women have a central voice in these movements, since women are disproportionately affected by sectarianism. And so I think the last point would just be that the issue of sexism and homophobia and transphobia within progressive or leftist movements in Lebanon, you know, that issue also needs to be, like, you know, I know you already saw my presentation, but that seemed to be a major obstacle for increasing women's political participation in grassroots movements. The silencing of women activists, the homophobia and transphobia, the lack of, women's leadership and women in decision-making positions. So I think those are all areas that can be taken. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia.
I mean, I guess one response thought is that one of my hesitancies about a lot of these discussions around politics and engagement is that it often sounds like something that other people are doing, and we're reflecting on what is the behavior of the politicians, etc., rather than what is it that we are doing? What is my behavior every day, every week? What is something that each person in this room is doing every week? Because we can never control what others are doing. We can only control our own behavior, and then collectively that builds towards mobilizing and pushing the others to do what we think is right. I mean, that's my sense of what is the nature of politics in the world, but we often I feel like here we often take a very passive, and in the US and much of the world, citizens are passive, politicians are active.
So we're running out of time, so we have room for one more question.
After Ghost incident, MTV shut down Joe Malouf's show, and they kicked him out. He went home, and no one ever dared to talk about that. And TV still refuses to cover LGBT movements or anything. We don't see protests on TV that are LGBT themed. The only LGBT when there's an episode or a TV program and the episode is about LGBT movements, it's usually in the presence of a first religious figure or a psychiatrist, because God knows we don't want an ill person to rule us. So how can we really reach the public and demand to be seen and have a voting base if the only mass way of reaching people is diminished?
I start with Joe Malouf. I think he's in a much better place now. He's in NBC. It's definitely a better option. NBC is the #1 TV station. He has much more better ratings now.
Yes.
So and he did every year he has at least 2 episodes about the LGBT rights. So definitely is another. I don't agree that the media is not covering enough. When we need them, I think in Lebanon, and this is something that changed a lot since 2004, the media is our ally. The Ghost incident was covered.
Sorry, but when they covered it, it's because it's trendy. And I don't care if it's trendy as long as we're talking about it.
I'm from NBC, sorry, but I'm from NBC and we're not covering only for trending. I'm talking from my personal perspective. I'm not from NBCI. We're not also following trending stories. We follow, we talk with all the NGOs. We follow every single lifestyle stories with the NGOs, with I talk to those every single week or and other NGOs to follow up for each story, not only the sexy story. And we have now special news, night news for youth, and to talk about LGBT and women rights, and to talk about women empowerment, and to talk about everyone in the street and in the social media, and to let everyone involved, not only politicians. So thank you.
Yeah. No, I have to say that there's a lot of things we need to address in the media, but we have to acknowledge as well that they played a big role, especially major TV stations and newspapers in supporting women's rights and LGBT rights. The issue of domestic violence. If NBC, one of the stations, did not cover every day, you had a story about domestic violence. This is how people were mobilized. This is why people came down to the street, because people were not aware about how big the domestic violence issue is until the media started covering it every day and pushing stories. The Ghost incident also was covered by NBC, and this is what pushed, the reaction against the mobilization against the municipality of Ukraine is still there, but that's the problem of the government, not the media. The whole anal testing as well, it was banned thanks to the coverage of the media of the protest. I think that the media is not our enemy here, and we need them, and they're our allies. Of course, there's the homophobic and the sexist media, but we need to find our allies within the media.
Just to end, I would like to say that I feel the same that Dr. Azzi. Definitely, the media is our ally nowadays. I mean, we had a campaign called عم نحكي السياسة, and it was about having the woman talking about politics on TV, and it was about increasing their presence on TV, and we have to say that all media are collaborating very, very well with us, and they're phoning every day asking for names for women to be hosted, and they're not doing it because it's trendy, because they're doing it because maybe in the back it's trendy, but means if it's trendy, that means that we succeeded somewhere to make this cause appealing to everyone.
Our official time is up, so I would have to wrap the session. Please join me in thanking our panelists for their great presentations. I really enjoyed the fact that we had a mix of academics and activists on the ground, and we tackled the topic of representation of women and minorities from really different perspectives. That was very enriching. So thank you, and I'm sure that you have much more questions. Feel free to continue the discussion after. Thank you.
This is Smart.